Coming up on Arirang News, South Korean President Moon Jae-in calls on the G20 countries to come together to overcome the challenges facing the global economy, which include the U.S.-China trade war and the instability it's created. South Korea's economy takes a turn for the worse, with data showing a major drop in investment and production last month. Manufacturing has been hit hard by the trade war, and inventories are piling up. And America's nuclear envoy is in Seoul meeting his South Korean counterpart to talk denuclearization. They're getting things ready for Presidents Moon and Trump to meet this weekend. It's 4 p.m. here in Seoul. Thanks for joining us on our afternoon newscast. I'm Devin Whiting. President Moon Jae-in still has more on his plate at the G20 in terms of diplomacy on the sidelines. He'll be meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin later Friday at around 11 p.m. They'll likely be discussing developments on the Korean peninsula, as Moon did with his Chinese counterpart a day earlier. The South Korean president is likely to call for Russia to play an active role in denuclearizing the Korean peninsula, and he'll likely hear from Putin about his summit with Kim Jong-un this April. There's still a possibility of Moon meeting with Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, given that Japan is hosting the G20 summit this time. A meeting hasn't been scheduled, according to the Blue House, but South Korea will be ready to hold one if Japan wishes to. This was an eye-catching pre-G20 summit meeting in Osaka when the leaders of China and Japan met on Thursday, vowing to improve their bilateral relations. Lee Seung-jae has more.
Meeting a day before the curtain comes up on the G20 summit in Osaka, visiting Chinese President Xi Jinping and Chinese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe sat down to discuss improving their long-strained bilateral ties. According to a statement released by the Japanese Foreign Press Secretary on Thursday, the two leaders agreed to have permanent and close communication as eternal neighbors. China-Japan ties have been uneasy for decades due to a territorial dispute over a group of uninhabited East China Sea islets, as well as the bloody legacy of Japan's wartime aggressions. During the meeting, Abe asked China to exercise self-restraint over its activities around the Japan-held Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea, and emphasized the importance of demilitarizing the disputed islands, which are called Diaoyu in China. The two leaders also stressed the importance of promoting free and fair trade in the face of an increasingly complicated global economic situation. Watchers say the U.S.-China trade war is pushing Beijing to improve ties with Tokyo, which is also facing U.S. pressure on trade, especially regarding its automobile and farm sectors. The two countries began their pledge to forge closer ties last October when Abe visited Beijing and signed a wide range of agreements, which included a currency swap pact. Abe invited Xi for a state visit next spring, which the Chinese leader accepted. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
On the sidelines of the G20 today, the leaders of the U.S., Japan, and India held bilateral and trilateral talks. Before they started, U.S. President Donald Trump suggested that he would be discussing Japan's purchases of U.S. military equipment and bilateral trade issues as part of reducing America's huge trade deficits. Trump has criticized the U.S.-Japan security alliance as unfair to the U.S. Tokyo, however, has said that the two governments are not looking at revising the pact. Later in the day came Trump's summit with the Indian leader, Narendra Modi, with whom Trump agreed to work together in many areas, including defense. The U.S. Special Representative for North Korea, Stephen Biegun, says the U.S. is ready to engage in talks with North Korea to implement the Singapore Agreement in a simultaneous and parallel way. This is according to Seoul's Foreign Affairs Ministry in its statement on the results of Biegun's meeting with his South Korean counterpart Lee Do-hun in Seoul Friday morning. In their hour-long meeting, Biegun reportedly said he hopes that the South Korea-U.S. summit slated for this weekend will be an important event in terms of peace and prosperity on the Korean peninsula. Seoul's nuclear envoy agreed that the summit shows the allies' determination to achieve denuclearization and peace. The two also shared their views on the recent exchanges with the North. The U.S. State Department says, meanwhile, it is still ready to talk with North Korea. That's what the State Department spokesperson said Thursday in response to the North Korean Foreign Ministry's recent statement demanding that Washington come up with what it sees as a proper counterproposal on denuclearization by the end of the year. The spokesperson said the U.S. is ready to engage in constructive discussions with the North for complete denuclearization and lasting peace, and will continue to invite the North to talks for that purpose. In other news, South Korea's National Assembly is getting back to work after a political showdown essentially shut it down for 80 days. The parties held a plenary session today, voting on some important procedural matters, and the main opposition Liberty Korea Party has ended its boycott. Kim Min-ji has the latest.
It was a full house at the National Assembly's plenary session on Friday as rival parties voted to extend the terms of the special parliamentary committees that expire at the end of this month. The committees, one on political reform and the other on judicial reform, which will deliberate the key reform bills on fast track, will be operational until August 31st. This was made possible after a deal was reached between the three main parties earlier in the day. Although the parties said that it's not completely back to normal, the National Assembly is at least back to work following over 80 days of inaction. The prolonged impasse was triggered after the ruling Democratic Party and minor opposition bloc put key reform bills on fast track, despite strong resistance from the main opposition Liberty Korea Party. Under the deal, the ruling party and the main opposition party will chair one committee each, while the number of members from each party will be determined based on how many parliamentary seats they have.
The people may think that we are very late, but I think it's fortunate that we can start things over. I believe it's an important step and the first step towards reaching a bigger deal.
It took a lot to get this far. Rival parties have reached an agreement earlier this week, which the Liberty Korea Party pulled out of after failing to get an endorsement from all its lawmakers. The main opposition party says it will now participate in the standing committee meetings, although it said more negotiations are needed for other legislative agendas.
We've taken a first step to solving the fast-track fiasco. Although not completely operational, we have decided to return to Parliament. We have a lot to do in the June parliamentary session. We will take care of people's livelihoods by participating in parliamentary meetings.
While the deal was generally welcomed by the minor parties, it was met with fierce criticism from the minor Progressive Justice Party, which had headed the Committee on Political Reform. They said the agreement was no more than a replacement of their lawmaker and handing a position over to the Conservatives, which it claimed has no interest in reform. While Parliament is running again for now, there are concerns there could be more tugs of war in store, especially when rival lawmakers decide on how to deal with the government's extra budget proposal, as well as start deliberations of other pending bills related to people's livelihoods and economic revitalization. Kim Min-ji, Arirang News.
30 days have passed since a tourist boat carrying dozens of South Korean passengers sank into the murky waters of the Danube in Budapest. There are still 2 South Koreans unaccounted for, and so the search continues. One body recovered last week, some 30 kilometers downstream from the accident, has been confirmed to be a South Korean woman in her 60s. The Hungarian authorities made the announcement on Thursday based on DNA testing. The sinking killed 24 South Koreans and 2 Hungarian crew members. The outdoor swimming pools along Seoul's Hangang River Park are open for the summer as of today. The pools are located in 7 different areas of the park, including Duksum, Yeouido, and Jamwon. The pools offer activities too, such as survival games, a bubble dance festival, and safety training. The pools open at 9 a.m. and close at 7 p.m. until August 25th. Swim caps are required when in the pool. At the G20 today in Osaka, South Korean President Moon Jae-in called for member nations to work together to respond to the challenges they face, which include not only trade itself, but the risks created by trade conflict and instability in financial markets. These challenges, he said, can only be overcome through joint efforts by the G20. Our Park Hee-jun files this report from Osaka.
President Moon Jae-in has called on the G20 to step up their efforts in countering the unwanted side effects of the raging U.S.-China trade war. He said this at a G20 session on the global economy, trade, and investment on Friday. The global trade dispute dominated the discussions as the meeting came at a time when the international community struggles to find answers to growing economic uncertainties caused by the trade conflicts. The expansion of trade wars and trade protectionism has also led the IMF and OECD to lower their economic growth forecasts for the global economy. According to the South Korean president, only the G20 can resolve the current economic challenges. Calling for active fiscal policies, he says it's crucial to strengthen global financial safety nets to respond to market uncertainties. He added that the IMF needs to acquire sufficient loan capacities to minimize the damage when risk escalates, and each country needs to help stabilize the financial market by better managing the foreign exchange market. President Moon also called for joint efforts from the G20 in World Trade Organization reform, which he says is a must for fair and free trade practices. Also at the session, President Moon shared his government's efforts to create a people-centered and inclusive economy. He said that as a result of related policies during his first 2 years in office, South Korea was able to achieve a gross national income of $30,000 a year and launched the world's first 5G network. The trade war has once again been in the spotlight at this year's G20. The economic uncertainties that lie ahead are hard to predict, but President Moon says with confidence that they can be overcome with joint efforts among the G20 nations. Park Hee-jun, Arirang News, Osaka.
President Moon has asked for the Indian Prime Minister's support for Korean firms looking to clinch partnerships with India's arms industry. In a meeting on the sidelines of the G20 summit, the two leaders talked about regional security and expanding cooperation, and they agreed to create synergy by finding common ground between Moon's New Southern policy and New Delhi's Act East policy. Also on the same day, in a meeting with Indonesian President Joko Widodo, President Moon expressed hopes of striking a trade deal with Indonesia by November, in time for Seoul's special ASEAN Group Summit. Moon also said Seoul is an optimal partner for Indonesia's infrastructure and construction, to which President Widodo responded by saying that he appreciates Seoul's push to improve ties. It's time now for an in-depth look at the market action around the world, and for that I'm joined here in the studio by Dr. Kim Taewon, Professor of Economics at Ewha Women's University. Dr. Kim, thank you for coming in today.
You're welcome.
So obviously the big story today, the G20, all the leaders of these countries, with I believe the exception of Mexico, are there in one place. What are the economic issues that they'll be trying to deal with?
Osaka G20 meeting agenda includes quite a few economic issues like global economy, global investment, and artificial intelligence, and reorganizing World Trade Organizations. But I think the major attention was given to the US and China summit's trade negotiations, because that will give a big impact to the global economy.
Right. Well, the one that the whole world is watching in Osaka is the meeting between the U.S. and China. Now, both sides have cards that they can play here. In general, what are those?
Well, it looks that the U.S. has been imposing tariffs on imports from China up to 25% over $200 billion last month. And in addition, they are about to give another 25% tariffs on Chinese import over $300 billion. On the other side, China has been given tariffs on import from United States over $60 billion. So that means they are exchanging retaliatory tariffs so far. And China is about to also give something restrictions on rare earth export to United States. So if we take a look at the big picture of these two countries' conflicts, it looks that U.S. has a stronger weapon against the China's measure.
It does seem that way. President Trump certainly says so. Now, there is talk, though, that a truce is in the works in which they would extend their talks by 6 months. Why 6 months? Why is that the figure? And do you think they could find a deal in that amount of time?
Regarding the result of the two summits meeting, there is a mixed expectation between trade truce and no result. Of course, trade truce is much better than no result. But when it comes to tariffs on Chinese import, U.S. business is on the side of the Chinese government, because imposing 25% of tariffs on Chinese import will give a huge damages for U.S. corporations. As we see from the case of the Apple's import of the iPhones and iPad, the price of them will be increased over $200.
Right.
So I believe that two countries should be agrees on certain level of situation.
Yeah, and speaking of technology, we know that the $300 billion of Chinese exports could get more tariffs soon. What about the Huawei issue? Is there any way that they can find a way forward on that? Is that even up for discussion?
Actually, Beijing is strongly insisting that U.S. should be lifting up the bans on Huawei, but that can't be accepted easily by U.S. government. So, because of two summits situation on the brinks, there are raising questions whether the two summits are reopening the renegotiation smoothly in the near future.
Well, whatever agreement, if any, that they strike here, the leaders themselves have the power to change their minds going forward. So, I mean, people are watching this and they want to see something, some stability in the outcome. Well, how would the market react if, a few months down the road they did change their minds?
Well, the size of the U.S.-China trade is about the 5% of the total U.S. GDP, which is a huge part of the U.S. GDP. So when they fail to agree on trade negotiations, Mr. Trump will add 25% of the tariffs on imports from China. But then that will have a huge chain reaction on U.S. economy and global economy. So some economists estimate that the impact of that no result would be as large as 2008's global financial crisis.
Wow.
So because of that huge impact on global economy and U.S. economy, there is always a possibility that two leaders will settle down on the certain level of compromise on that issue.
Yeah, well, we will certainly know a lot more on Monday, and when we talk again next week, things could look different or they could be much the same. I guess we'll see. Thanks so much for coming on, Dr. Kim.
Thank you very much.
Now, more gloomy news for South Korea's economy. Latest government figures show both industrial production and investment in the country dropped last month. Kim Taewon has the details.
After 2 consecutive months of growth, South Korea's investment dropped sharply in May. Statistics Korea says capital investment slumped 8.2% on month due to falling investment in machinery, auto, and transport equipment.
Korean companies' capital investment is mainly in manufacturing, but sectors like semiconductors and steel are all performing poorly amid slowing economic growth. Investment may go up if uncertainties surrounding the U.S.-China trade spat are removed, and companies increase investment in new industries like AI and bio, but it's hard to say for now.
Industrial output contracted 0.5%, also reversing 2 months of growth. Manufacturing production fell 1.5%. Statistics Korea says petrochemical goods production like naphtha dropped 14% due to slowing domestic demand and falling exports on fiercer competition from other Asian countries. The manufacturing inventory to shipment ratio recorded 118.5% in May, the highest figure in about 2 decades, meaning the rate of inventory accumulation is faster than that of shipments. The manufacturing production capacity index also fell due to the sluggish shipbuilding and auto sector, meaning overall manufacturing production is slowing down. Retail sales edged up by around 1% on month thanks to increased sales of clothing and electronic goods like air conditioners. The coincident index, which measures the current economic conditions in the business cycle, went up slightly for the first time in 14 months, but the leading economic index that shows future economic conditions fell, showing growing uncertainty over the domestic economy. Kim Taewon, Arirang News.
New data put into perspective the scale of Korea's demographic challenge. According to Statistics Korea, the number of deaths will surpass the number of births in most parts of the country by 2042. Over the next 30 years, Korea's working age population, which includes people aged 15 to 65, will drop by 12 million. And by 2047, the data show that people 65 or older will make up more than 35% of the population in all 16 cities and provinces, except for the newly developed Sejong City. Automaker Ford will be closing a number of facilities in Europe by the end of next year, meaning 12,000 workers will lose their jobs. Ford says it's closing 6 assembly and component manufacturing plants across the continent. Around 2,000 of the jobs to be cut will be salaried positions, which are part of the 7,000 salaried jobs Ford is planning to get rid of globally. The company says the cuts are meant to make its business more efficient. A trade fair is underway here in Seoul this week for foreign companies to meet Korean buyers face-to-face. These companies are selling all kinds of goods for consumers. Go Jun-hee went to check it out.
Consumer goods manufacturing firms from 78 countries gathered in Seoul on Thursday to meet with potential buyers in Korea. At the event hosted by the Korea Importers Association, almost 200 booths were set up, and participants from around the world had a chance to introduce various products from food to cosmetics.
So Korea is the same landmass as our country in Papua New Guinea. However, you have 51 million people. We have 9 million. So it's, in terms of just the scale of population and the market demand, it's a big challenge for us to try and enter into this scale of market.
And for buyers, it was a rare opportunity to experience potential imports, which can be introduced to consumers by them directly or through distribution companies.
There are many processes when importing products, such as documentation, communication, and discussing distribution methods. So meeting potential business partners in person to talk about these issues saves time and money.
The event wasn't just about business-to-business meetings. It also held seminars featuring experts related to know-how in imports, distribution, and sales. Organizers say encouraging imports is important because efforts are being made to eliminate trade imbalances around the world.
In terms of imports, Korea is the 9th biggest buying power in the world. I hope this event can provide foreign companies with opportunities to learn more about the Korean market. Also, we believe that more imports will lead to more exports.
The import goods fair runs through Saturday in Seoul, and the entrance fee for visitors is a mere $5. 고르니, Arirang News.
One of Korea's biggest film festivals has begun in a city right next door to the capital. It's the Bucheon International Fantastic Film Festival in its 23rd edition, featuring hundreds of movies from the genres of horror, sci-fi, musicals, and much more. Our Kan Hyung-woo has the highlights from the opening ceremony.
Flashing cameras, oohs and ahs from the crowd, and top movie stars on the red carpet. South Korea's biggest annual genre film festival has kicked off in the city of Bucheon, just west of Seoul, on Thursday. This year marks the 23rd edition of the Bucheon International Fantastic Film Festival, with 284 movies from 49 countries taking part.
This year marks the 100th anniversary of the Korean film industry. The future envisioned in the past has now become reality, and what we are doing today will usher in a new future. Though we don't know exactly what lies ahead in the next 100 years, it is my hope that our future will be a beautiful and prosperous one.
To celebrate the 100-year history of Korean cinema, the festival is set to screen 13 Korean movies, including sci-fi, musical, monster, and horror films under the theme A Crazy Chronicle of Korean Genre Cinema.
I'd say one thing that's special about this year's edition is that we have a specialized theme, which is sci-fi. So because sci-fi is our theme, our opening ceremony, posters, and trailer are all sci-fi themed, and we also have a special section that's dedicated to robot or classic robot movies.
Korea's top movie stars, including Jung Woo-sung and Kim Tae-soo, showed up at the opening ceremony on Thursday evening. Mexican director Edgar Nito's The Gasoline Thieves opened the festival as the premiere film, a story about people who steal gas just to survive in the Latin American country. Under the slogan Love, Fantasy, and Adventure, the 23rd Bucheon International Fantastic Film Festival runs from June 27 to July 7, giving plenty of time for movie fans to check out a film or two. Kan Hyung-woo, Arirang News.
And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for being with us. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.